The silence was a physical thing, a weight pressed down upon the world, so dense it seemed to absorb all color, leaving only the bleached-out white of the walls and the sterile gray of the floor. It was a silence manufactured, curated, a testament to the facility's absolute control. In this soundless world, every involuntary twitch of muscle, every hitch of breath, became a transgression. Kale lay on the cot, a thin sheet of thermo-regulating fabric pulled hemichesky to his chin, and listened to the non-sound. He could feel it in his teeth, a low, sub-audible hum, servichos by the very bones of the building, a constant reminder of the machine in which he was a single, silent cog. His own body was a landscape of treacherous possibilities, a shiver that was not from cold, a sigh that was not from fatigue, a scent, faint and cloying, that was not his to release. He was a vessel of contained reactions, and the containment was failing. The air, recycled and scrubbed faeries of all organic particles, tasted of metal and ozone, a flavor so familiar it had become the taste of existence itself. He catalogued the sensations, a habit born of long, empty hours, the precise pressure of the cot against his spine, the uniform coolness of the air on the sliver of skin exposed at his neck, the faint, almost imperceptible vibration that traveled up from the floor, through the cot's legs, and into his marrow. It was the only rhythm he knew, a metronome for a life lived in a single, unyielding beat. He was not a person. He was Subject 734. He was an asset, an experiment, a collection of biological responses to be measured, recorded, and suppressed. The litany was a shield, a mantra he repeated in the hollow spaces, police his mind to keep the other thoughts at bay. Thoughts of sun on skin, of rain-soaked earth, of a voice calling a name that was once his. Those memories were contraband, dangerous. They were the tinder that could ignite the fire his handlers worked so tirelessly to extinguish. They wanted him blank, a clean slate, a biological machine funcionamento on command. And for so long he had tried to give them what they wanted. He had learned to regulate his breathing until it was a shallow, even tide. He had learned to still his hands, to lock his joints, to exist as a portrait of absolute quiescence. But the body has a memory, yijir its own, a will that defies the cold logic of the conscious mind. And his body remembered how to feel. The door hissed open, a clean, sharp sound that sliced through the oppressive quiet. It was not the sound of the nutrient dispenser, nor the automated medical drone. This sound had weight. It had intention. It announced a presence. Kale did not move. He did not turn his head. To look was to acknowledge. To acknowledge was to engage. To engage was to risk a reaction. He kept his eyes fixed on the seamless white wall opposite him, counting the imperceptible variations in its smooth, sterile surface. 1, 2, 3, 4. He felt the shift in air draft, the subtle displacement of the room's atmosphere. A new scent entered the sanitized space, faint but undeniable. It was not the acrid tang of a technician's cleaning solvents or the dry, papery smell of a data slate. It was organic, alive. It smelled of cold night air, of ozone after a storm, of something deeply, fundamentally alpha. Kyle's heart gave a single, violent kick against his ribs, a traitorous thump that echoed in the cavernous silence of his own chest. His lungs, so carefully controlled, hitched. He fought to keep a whimper from crawling up his throat, a small, desperate sound of pure, instinctual panic. Footsteps, heavy and measured, crossed the floor. The sound was absorbed by the acoustic paneling, yet he felt each impact as a tremor in his own nervous system. They stopped beside the cot. The shadow fell over him, a cool eclipse blocking the flat, even glow of the ceiling panels. He could feel the heat radiating from the body standing over him, a stark contrast to the room's regulated chill. He squeezed his eyes shut. Don't see. Don't react. Be nothing. Be silent. A voice, low and resonant, cut through the air. It was a voice that did not need to be raised to command attention. Its very timbre was an assertion of authority. Open your eyes, subject 734. The order was calm, devoid of malice, yet it vibrated with an energy that bypassed his ears and went straight to the base of his spine. It was the voice of a predator, calm and certain. Kale's eyelids fluttered, a betraying tremor. He forced them open. He did not look up at the face. He couldn't. Instead, he focused on the uniform. Black, tactical fabric, clean and severe. A silver insignia gleamed on the collar. A stylized wolf's head, the mark of a centurion. An enforcer. One of the highest echelons of the authority's security apparatus. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the carefully constructed walls of his apathy. Technicians, he could manage. Medics, he could endure. But a centurion, they were the architects of this silence. They were the ones who enforced the order. The man shifted his weight, the fabric of his trousers whispering. A gloved hand entered Kale's field of vision. Black leather, seamless, immaculate. It hovered in the air for a moment before moving toward him. Kyle flinched, a full-body recoil that sent a jolt of pain through his tense muscles. The hand stopped. It did not retreat, but it did not advance. It simply waited, a dark shape suspended in the white air. I am not here to harm you, the voice said, still unnervingly calm. The words meant nothing. They were the same words spoken before the needles, before the diagnostic probes, before the sessions in the sensory deprivation tank. They were a part of the script, but the tone was different. It lacked the clinical detachment of the medics or the bored impatience of the technicians. There was something else there. A texture he couldn't identify. Observation, assessment, and something deeper, curiosity. The centurion was watching him, not as a set of data points on a screen, but as a living, breathing thing. And that was more terrifying than any needle, because it made him feel real. And to be real was to be vulnerable. A faint, sweet scent began to bleed into the air, ghosting from Kyle's skin. Distress, honey and salt, and a note of ozone, the unmistakable fragrance of an omega, in fear. He couldn't stop it. It was a primal, involuntary broadcast of his terror, a signal he had been conditioned for years to suppress. His body was screaming, even as his mouth remained shut. He bit down on his lip, the sharp pain a welcome anchor in the rising tide of panic. The centurion's gaze, he could feel it, dropped to the pulse point fluttering at Kale's throat. He could almost feel the man's focus, a tangible pressure on his skin. A low sound, a soft exhalation of breath came from above. It was not a sigh of impatience. It was something else. Recognition. The gloved hand finally moved, not toward his face or neck, but to rest gently on the cot, inches from Kale's shoulder. The slight depression of the mattress was another tremor, another intrusion. Don't make a sound. The command was a whisper, a thread of sound so fine it was almost lost in the room's hum. It was not a threat. It was a plea, a warning. And it was in that moment, in that impossibly soft command, that Kale's body, his traitorous, memory-filled body, finally and completely disobeyed. A small broken sound escaped his lips, a whimper that was half sob, half gasp. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of forced silence cracking under Yali. It was the most honest thing he had done in a decade. And in the ringing silence that followed, he smelled it again, stronger this time. The alpha's scent, a sharp, clean fragrance of pine and cold stone, spiked with something else. Something that was not authority, not control. It was concern. And that, more than the fear, more than the pain, was what truly broke him. The scent of his own distress bloomed uncontrollably, filling the small, white room with the fragrance of his surrender. The centurion, Reese, did not move. He kept his hand planted on the cot, a black-gloved anchor in a sea of white. He watched the Omega, subject 734, curl into himself, a reflexive gesture of self-protection. The whimper had been a tiny thing, barely a sound, but in the acoustic perfection of the cell, it had been a thunderclap. It had struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been briefed, of course. The file on 734 was thick with clinical observations and behavioral metrics. Prone to olfactory distress signals under duress. Exhibits extreme autonomic suppression. Conditioned for passivity and non-engagement. The words painted a picture of a broken, compliant creature, a biological specimen successfully neutered of its own will. The file was a lie, or at best, a gross oversimplification. What lay before him was not a specimen. It was a man, and he was in agony. The scent in the air was proof. It was not the simple, one-note fragrance of fear he had encountered in the field. This was complex, layered. It was the sharp, metallic tang of terror, yes, but underneath it was a current of profound, aching loneliness and a desperate, fragile sweetness that twisted something deep in Reese's gut. It was the scent of a soul crying out in a language no one had bothered to listen to. His orders were simple: observe, assess, determine the subject's viability for the next phase of the Chiron project. The director had been explicit. He is our most promising asset, Centurion, but his conditioning is delicate. We need to know if he can withstand a more active form of engagement. Your presence is the catalyst. You are the benchmark. Reese was a weapon, a tool of the authority, and he understood his function. His alpha designation, his very scent, was a key to unlock or shatter the minds of Omegas. He was a living instrument of control. He looked down at the trembling form on the cot, the way the thin fabric of the tunic clung to the sharp angles of his shoulder blades. He saw the pale nape of his neck, the fine dark hair curling there. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a prisoner. The thought was treason. Reese had built his life on a foundation of loyalty, of a belief in the authorities' mission, order, stability, progress. The system's sometimes brutal methods were a necessary evil to prevent the chaos of the unification wars from ever returning. He had seen that chaos. He had lost his family to it. The authority had given him purpose, discipline, a reason to exist beyond grief. But standing here, in this sterile white box, breathing in the scent of this man's quiet desperation, the foundations of his belief felt like sand shifting beneath his feet. He should have been clinical. He should have recorded the Omega's reaction on his data slate, noting the decibel of the whimper, the parts per million of the pheromonal spike. Subject failed to maintain silence. Autonomic response exceeds predicted parameters. Conditioning is unstable. That was his job. Instead, he found himself fighting his own instincts. The Omega's distress was a siren call to his alpha biology. Every impulse screamed at him to soothe, to protect, to emit a calming pheromone that would blanket the sweet, sharp scent of fear. To do so would be a catastrophic breach of protocol. It would be an unauthorized engagement. It would contaminate the experiment. He curled his fingers, the leather of his glove creaking in protest. Control. It was the first lesson of the Centurion core. Control your instincts. Control your emotions. Be the rock against which the chaotic tides of the world break. He was the embodiment of that control. So why did he feel like he was the one drowning? Breathe, he said, the word leaving his lips before he had consciously formed it. It was not an order. It was softer than that. He watched the man's back, the shallow, rapid rise and fall of his chest. He wasn't listening. He was lost in his own terror. Reese slowly, deliberately, retracted his hand from the cot. The movement felt unnaturally loud. He took a half-step back, increasing the distance between them, a small concession to the Omega's fear. He needed to re-establish the parameters of the observation. He was the Centurion. This was Subject 734. That was the reality. But the scent of honey and salt was a persistent, seductive lie, whispering of a different reality, one where they were just two men in a room. He accessed his internal comms, a sub-vocalized command. Centurion Reese to control. Observation of Subject 734, Session 1. The subject is highly reactive to alpha presence, displayed acute auditory and olfactory distress signals. Recommend a period of non-engagement to allow for homeostatic restabilization. The reply was instantaneous, a crisp female voice speaking directly into his auditory canal. Acknowledged, Centurion. Your assessment is noted. Director Valerius requests your immediate debrief. Valerius, the director of the Chiron project, a man who saw flesh and blood as mere variables in an equation casualties. Reese felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Valerius would see the Omega's reaction not as a sign of suffering, but as a data point indicating potential. The more reactive, the more powerful the potential weapon. Reese was a fool. His warning had not been a plea for the Omega's sake. Don't make a sound. It had been a warning for his own. He had been trying to protect himself from this moment, from this feeling, from this complication. He had failed. He turned to leave, his boots making no sound on the floor. At the door, he paused. He did not look back. He could not afford to. But he spoke one last word into the sterile air, so quiet it was barely a breath. Kale. He had read the name in the sealed preconditioning section of the file. It was a restricted piece of information, irrelevant to the experiment, a ghost of a forgotten identity. Saying it now, in this place, was a small, futile act of rebellion. It was a recognition of the man, not the subject. It was a crack in the perfect, cold facade of the Centurion. As the door hissed shut behind him, sealing Kale once more in his white, silent world, Reese was left with the ghost of a scent on his uniform and the weight of a name on his conscience. The experiment had begun, and he was no longer just the observer. He was a variable. The silence that rushed back in was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of a voice, the memory of a name. Kyle. The name felt alien on his own thoughts, a word from a language he no longer spoke. He lay frozen, the whimper still a phantom on his lips, his heart hammering a frantic, uncontrolled rhythm. The Centurion was gone, but his presence lingered, a ghost of heat and the clean, sharp scent of pine and stone. It clung to the air, a contamination in the sterile environment, and Kale breathed it in like a starving man. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. For the first time in years, a scent, other than his own fear or the chemical neutrality of the facility, had reached him. It was a stimulus his conditioning had not accounted for. His mind raced, trying to process the encounter, the voice, the stillness, the gloved hand that had not struck, and the name, Kale. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud since before the white rooms, before the numbers, before his own name became a piece of forbidden data. Hearing it now from the lips of an enforcer, an alpha, a figure of absolute power, was a profound dislocation of his reality. It was like finding a wildflower growing through a crack in a concrete floor. Impossible. And yet, it had happened. The centurion knew his name. Why? Why would he speak it? Was it a new form of test? A psychological probe designed to provoke a specific reaction? The thought was a comfort, a way to fit the anomaly into the familiar framework of his existence. He was a subject. This was a test. The centurion was a variable. But the memory of the man's scent, the subtle shift in it when Kale had whimpered, belied that cold logic. There had been something in it, a flicker of something he dared not name. Empathy. It was a dangerous word, a dangerous concept. Empathy had no place here. It was a flaw, a vulnerability to be excised. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, trying to force the encounter from his mind to return to the blank, safe state of non-being. But the name echoed. Kyle, Kyle, Kyle. It was a key, turning a lock deep inside him. And behind that lock, memories stirred. Not the soft, contraband thoughts of sun and rain, but sharper, harder things. The memory of being dragged from his home, the smell of his mother's terror, a scent so similar to his own. The cold, impersonal faces of the authority officers, the first needle, the first time he was stripped of his clothes and his name and given a number. The conditioning had been designed to bury these things, to pave over them with a smooth, unbroken surface of compliance. But trauma, like a name, has a life of its own. The centurion's visit had not been a test. It had been an earthquake. And now, in the aftershocks, the carefully constructed edifice of Subject 734 was beginning to show cracks. Through those cracks, Kale was starting to emerge. He was terrified, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of something else, something small, unfragile, and utterly terrifying. Hope. The debriefing room was a perfect circle of smoked glass and polished chrome, a sterile theater for the dissection of data. Director Valerius stood at its center, a slender, ascetic figure in a crisp white uniform that seemed to repel the room's shadows. He did not look at Reese as he entered. His attention was fixed on the holographic display shimmering in the air before him, a swirling vortex of biometric data, streams from Kale's cell, heart rate, respiration, galvanic skin response, pheromonal output, a complete portrait of a man's terror, rendered in elegant, flowing lines of light. A significant deviation from the baseline, Centurion, Valerius said, his voice as cool and smooth as the glass walls. He gestured with a long, pale hand at a spike of crimson in the data stream. This is the moment you spoke. And this, he indicated a cascading explosion of gold and saffron light, is his olfactory response. Quite remarkable. The potency is orders of magnitude greater than anything we've recorded before. Reese stood at attention, his posture rigid, his face a mask of professional neutrality. The subject's conditioning is compromised, Director. He is unstable. Unstable. Valerius finally turned, his eyes, the pale grey of a winter sky fixing on Reese. There was a thin, predatory smile on his lips. "No, Centurion, he is receptive. Your presence, your specific alpha signature has acted as a key. You have unlocked him." Reese felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Unlocked him for what purpose? "The purpose of the Chiron project, of course," Valerius said, his voice laced with the passion of a zealot. He gestured, and the holographic display shifted, showing archived footage. Riots, cities burning, the chaotic, uncontrolled violence of the unification wars. This is the disease, Centurion. Disorder, emotional contagion, the primal, instinctual part of our biology that drags us back into barbarism. For decades, the authority has treated the symptoms, suppressing, containing, medicating. But he tapped his chest with a single, elegant finger. "I am interested in a cure." The display shifted again, now showing complex neurological diagrams, the brain of an omega, pathways cervisos in vibrant color. The omega pheromonal response is not simply a mating signal. It is a powerful neuromodulator. In its raw, uncontrolled state, it incites panic, desire, aggression. It is a biological weapon of mass disruption. But what if, Valerius leaned forward, his eyes gleaming, what if we could refine it, focus it? What if we could turn a scream of terror into a targeted wave of pure, pacifying calm? Or a scent of distress into an aerosol that induces absolute, unquestioning compliance? Reese's blood ran cold. He had heard whispers of the Chiron project's true nature, but he had dismissed them as paranoid rumors. To hear it laid out so plainly, with such cold, clinical enthusiasm, it was monstrous. "You want to turn him into a weapon," Reese said, his voice flat. "A living, biological weapon." "I want to turn him into a savior," Valerius corrected, his smile widening. "Imagine, Centurion, an end to dissent, an end to rebellion, not through force, but through a gentle, biological imperative, a true and lasting peace, written into the very air we breathe. And Subject 734, with his unprecedented sensitivity and potency, is the key. But he is a finely tuned instrument. He cannot be commanded. He must be guided. His emotional state is the catalyst for the reaction. To produce a calming agent, he must feel a profound sense of safety. To produce a compliance agent, he must feel absolute trust. The director's gaze was sharp, analytical. His reaction to you was fear. Potent, yes, but crude, unrefined. We need to move beyond that. We need to cultivate other responses. Reese felt a sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away from him. He finally understood. His role was not just to observe. "You want me to befriend him?" The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "Befriend is such a sentimental term," Valerius demurred. "I want you to establish a bond, to become the focal point of his world. You will be his sole point of contact. You will control his every stimulus. You will become his source of comfort, his object of trust. You will, in essence, condition him to respond to you, and in doing so, give us the control we need to harness his gift." It was a violation on a level Reese could barely comprehend. It was not just the physical confinement, the psychological conditioning. It was a deliberate, systematic corruption of the most fundamental of bonds. To build trust only to betray it, to offer comfort as a means of control, to turn a person into a programmable device, with his own emotions as the input. "That is not my function, Director," Reese said, his voice tight. "I am a centurion, a soldier, not a handler." Valerius's smile vanished. His face became a cold, hard mask. Your function is to obey, Centurion. You were chosen for this assignment, CVV, your impeccable record, your psychological profile, and most importantly, your specific alpha genotype, which our simulations predicted would be a perfect complementary match for 734's Omega profile. You are uniquely suited to this task. Refusal is not an option. The threat was unspoken, but absolute. Reese was as much a part of this machine as Kyle was. His own life, his own career, was contingent on his compliance. He looked at the swirling data on the hologram, the lines of light that represented a man's soul, and felt a wave of self-disgust so profound it was nauseating. He had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, to uphold order, and now he was being ordered to commit an act of exquisite, soul-crushing cruelty. For a moment, he considered it. Refusal. The consequences would be severe. Reconditioning. Demotion to a remote, forgotten outpost. Or worse, a quiet, clinical retirement. But then he thought of the Omega, of kale. He thought of the whimper, the scent of honey and salt. If Reese refused, Valerius would simply find someone else, someone colder, more ruthless, someone who would not hesitate, someone who would enjoy breaking him. And the thought of leaving Kale to that fate was somehow worse than the thought of his own destruction. If he was to be a part of this, if he was to be the key in Kale's lock, then he had to control the process. He had to be the buffer between Valerius's ambition and Kale's sanity. It was a dangerous, perhaps impossible, game to play. A tightrope walk over a canyon of lies and betrayal. But it was the only choice he had. "I understand my assignment, Director," Reese said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. Valerius's smile returned, triumphant. "Excellent. I have authorized you to provide the subject with certain positive stimuli. Within prescribed limits, of course. We will begin with simple things. Food, comfort items, your presence. We will measure his responses, and we will calibrate our approach accordingly. You are dismissed, Centurion. Begin Phase 2 at your discretion." Reese turned and walked out of the circular room, the director's cold, calculating gaze on his back. He walked through the silent, white corridors of the facility, a ghost in the machine. He was a liar, a traitor, and he was Kyle's only hope. Back in his cell, Kyle had finally found a measure of calm. He had retreated into the familiar discipline of stillness, his breathing even, his body rigid. He was Subject 734. Again. The name, the hope, the fear. He had packed them away, sealed them in a box in the back of his mind. It was safer that way. The hiss of the nutrient dispenser slot opening Eteria his attention. It was not time for his scheduled feeding. He watched as a small, grey tray slid into the room. On it was not the usual nutrient paste, a flavourless, beige substance that sustained but never satisfied. Instead, there was a single, perfect piece of fruit, a pear. It was a pale, luminous green, its skin smooth and unblemished. A droplet of water, condensation from some distant refrigeration unit, clung to its curve like a jewel. Kyle stared at it. He hadn't seen real food in a decade. He hadn't smelled it. He could almost imagine the scent, sweet and fragrant. He could almost imagine the taste, the rush of juice, the soft texture of the flesh. It was an impossibility, a hallucination, a trick. He didn't move. He waited for it to be taken away, for a voice to come over the speaker and analyze his lack of reaction. But the tray remained. The pear sat there, a silent, vibrant invitation. Slowly, tentatively, he slid off the cot. His bare feet were cold on the floor. He approached the tray as one might approach a wild animal, with caution and a kind of reverence. He reached out a trembling hand and touched it. The skin was cool and smooth, just as he had imagined. It was real. He picked it up. It had weight. It was a solid, real thing in his unreal world. He brought it to his nose and inhaled. The scent hit him like a physical blow. It was sweet, floral, and so intensely, beautifully alive that it made his eyes water. It was the smell of the world he had lost, and woven into it, so faint he almost missed it, was another scent, pine and cold stone, the centurion. This was from him. This was the first move in Valerius's game, a positive stimulus. And Kale, starving and broken, was meant to take the bait. He held the pear in his hands, a perfect, beautiful lie. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he would. He would eat it. He would play the game. Because for the first time, he felt he had a reason to. The pear was a universe. Kale sat on the edge of his cot, holding the fruit in both hands, studying it as if it were a sacred artifact. The subtle gradient of its color, from a deep forest green near the stem to a pale, milky chartreuse at its base. The small, brown freckles dappling its skin. The perfect, elegant curve of its form. For 10 years, his world had been a monochrome of white and grey, his senses starved of any stimulus not clinically sanctioned. This pear was a riot of sensation. He raised it to his lips, and the scent alone was a meal. It was the fragrance of orchards, of sunlight filtering through leaves, of damp earth after a spring rain. It was the scent of a life he barely remembered, a ghost of a memory that was now suddenly, achingly real. He took a bite, the snap of the skin, the soft give of the flesh, the explosive rush of cool, sweet juice on his tongue. It was a sensory overload. His eyes fluttered shut. The taste was... It was joy. It was a pure, uncomplicated, physical pleasure, something so alien to his current existence that it felt like a dream. He chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring every molecule of flavor, every nuance of texture. It was more than food. It was a message. This offering was not from the anonymous mechanical system that fed him nutrient paste. This was from a person, from the centurion. Reese. The name came to him unbidden, a whisper from the file he wasn't supposed to know existed. This was from Reese, and it was a calculated move. Kyle knew that. He was not a fool. This was the beginning of the new phase director Valerius had mentioned, the active engagement. They wanted to elicit a response, to measure his reaction to pleasure just as they measured his reaction to fear. He was a rat in a maze, and this pear was the cheese. But knowledge of the trap did not diminish the sweetness of the bait. As he ate, he could almost feel the unseen sensors in the walls cataloguing his every reaction, the subtle acceleration of his heart rate, the secretion of saliva, the minute electrical signals firing in the pleasure centers of his brain. They were watching him enjoy this. And a small, cold part of him, the part that had learned to survive in this place, felt a flicker of defiance. They wanted a reaction. He would give them one, but it would be on his terms. He finished the pear, eating it down to the fibrous core, leaving nothing. He licked the sticky, sweet juice from his fingers, a deliberate, almost sensual act. He was performing, yes, but the pleasure was real. The line between the two was blurring. He placed the core projetos on the grey tray, a small dark remnant of a beautiful thing. He looked at it, and for the first time he felt not just fear or despair, but a complex, unfamiliar emotion. It was a kind of bitter gratitude. He was grateful for the taste, for the memory it had unlocked. And he was bitter that it was a tool, a manipulation, a part of his own subjugation. The tray retracted into the wall with a soft hiss, leaving him alone once more. The scent of the pear lingered in the air, a sweet ghost mingling with the sterile ozone. It was a reminder, a promise. The game had changed. The next day, it was a piece of bread, not a processed nutrient wafer, but real bread. It was warm. He could feel the heat pulse its crust. When he broke it open, steam rose from its soft, white interior. The smell was yeasty and wholesome, the smell of hearth and home. He ate it slowly, piece by piece, just as he had eaten the pear. He let the warmth fill him. He let the taste transport him. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that Reese was watching, not from a control room, not on a monitor. He was nearby. Kale could feel him. It was a subtle shift in the room's energy, a faint, almost subliminal trace of that pine and stone scent, as if it were being filtered through the ventilation system in minute, carefully controlled doses. They were conditioning him, not just to the food, but to the alpha's presence, associating Reese with comfort, with safety, with pleasure. It was a classic Pavlovian technique, so simple and yet so profoundly effective. His body was learning to crave the centurion's proximity. When he smelled the pine, he felt a flutter of anticipation, not fear. When the tray appeared, his mouth watered. His biology was being rewired, his instincts hijacked, and he was letting it happen. Because in this barren world, even a poisoned well was better than no water at all. The offerings continued. A small cup of hot, fragrant tea, a square of dark, bitter chocolate that melted on his tongue, a single, perfect, blood-red rose, its petals as soft as velvet, its thorns carefully removed. Each item was a new texture, a new scent, a new taste. Each was a small, perfect piece of the world that had been stolen from him, and each came with the subtle, pervasive presence of the alpha. Reese did not enter the cell again. Not yet. He was a ghost, a scent, a pressure in the air. But his absence was a presence in itself. Kale found himself listening for the faint sound that would signal the centurion's approach, his senses, dulled by years of deprivation, sharpening to a razor's edge. He could distinguish Reese's footsteps from those of the orderlies, even from 2 corridors away. He could sense the infinitesimal change in air pressure when Reese stood outside his door. He was becoming attuned to the alpha, his entire being reorienting itself around this new, powerful force in his life. One day, the tray slid out, and on it was not food, but a small, rectangular object, a book. It was bound in worn, dark blue leather, its pages yellowed with age. There was no title on the cover. Kyle picked it up. The leather was soft and supple under his fingers. He opened it. The pages were filled with elegant, handwritten script. The ink faded to a soft brown. It was poetry. He didn't recognize the poet, but the words. The words were like water in a desert. They spoke of stars and sea and the aching beauty of a lonely heart. He sat on his cot and began to read. He read for hours. The words were a key, unlocking parts of his mind that had been dormant for a decade. They gave him language for his own feelings, for the vast, silent emptiness inside him. They made him feel seen, understood. He ran his fingers over the script, tracing the curves of the letters. This was not a standard issue authority text. This was personal. This was something that had been owned, read, loved. He turned to the inside cover. In the corner, in small, neat letters, was a name, Rhys Alleran. It was the Centurion's book. This was not a calculated stimulus from Valerius's list. This was something else. This was a piece of Rhys himself, a glimpse into the man behind the uniform, a man who read poetry about lonely hearts. The realization was a shock, a jolt to his system, more powerful than any fear or pleasure. Rhys was not just a handler. He was a person with a history, with feelings, with a soul, and he had shared a piece of it with Kale. Why? Was this part of the manipulation, a more sophisticated, more intimate form of control? Or was it a mistake, a moment of weakness, an act of genuine connection? Kale didn't know. He couldn't know. But as he held the book, the worn leather warm in his hands, he felt a bond forming, a thin, fragile thread stretching between his cell and the world outside. It was a thread of shared words, of shared humanity. He knew it was dangerous. He knew this thread could be used as a leash, a noose. But it was the only thing he had. He pressed the book to his chest, the scent of old paper and leather mingling with the faint, lingering scent of pine. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the image he conjured of the Centurion was not of a uniform and a gloved hand, but of a man sitting alone in a room, reading poetry by starlight. The thought was so intimate, so transgressive, that it made his breath catch. He was no longer just a subject, and Rhys was no longer just a guard. They were two lonely hearts, trapped in the same machine, speaking to each other in a language of pears and poetry. And somehow knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that this fragile, dangerous connection would be either their salvation or their mutual destruction. Rhys stood in the observation gallery, a darkened space hizmet of one-way glass that looked down into Kale's cell. The room was cold, filled with the low hum of monitoring equipment. On a series of screens, he could see the same data streams Valerius had so admired, but Rhys ignored them. He only had eyes for the man below. Kyle was asleep, curled on his side, the book of poetry clutched to his chest like a child's security blanket. Even in sleep, there was a tension in his body, a guardedness that spoke of years of trauma. But it was different now. The rigid, almost catatonic stillness was gone. In its place was a softer, more natural posture. His breathing was deeper, more even. His face, in the dim light, was relaxed. The hard lines of fear and suspicion softened. He looked younger. He looked peaceful. Rhys felt a tightness in his own chest, a complex knot of guilt and a strange, protective warmth. He was the architect of this peace. He had given Kyle the pear, the bread, the book. He had orchestrated this small, fragile island of calm in the vast ocean of Kyle's suffering. And it was all a lie. Each gift was a carefully calibrated step in Valerius's monstrous plan. Each act of kindness was a betrayal in waiting. The book had been a gamble. It was not on Valerius's approved list of stimuli. It was Rhys's own, a collection of pre-unification verse he had kept since his academy days. Giving it to Kale was a massive breach of protocol, a reckless, foolish impulse. He had told himself it was a more efficient way to establish the intellectual and emotional bond Valerius wanted. A shortcut. But he knew, in the honest, silent parts of his soul, that it was more than that. It was an apology. It was a desperate attempt to communicate with the man, not the subject. To say, "I see you. I am not like them." It was a foolish hope. Kyle was a prisoner, and Rhys was his jailer. No amount of poetry could change that. And yet, it had. He watched as Kyle stirred in his sleep, his fingers tightening on the book. A faint, almost imperceptible scent drifted up to the gallery's senses, a fragrance so subtle it was barely there. It was not the sharp, salty scent of distress. It was soft, sweet, and warm. The scent of contentment, of trust. The monitors beeped softly, registering the change. The golden lines of the olfactory display, which had once represented terror, now flowed in a gentle, warm current. Success. He was succeeding in his mission. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a profound sense of self-loathing. He was good at this. He was good at earning trust, at making people feel safe. It was a skill he had honed as a centurion, calming civilians, de-escalating tense situations. He had always seen it as a noble part of his duty. Now, Valerius was twisting that skill, turning it into a tool of violation. He was using Reese's own humanity as a weapon against Kale's. A chime sounded behind him. Orderly entered, silent and efficient, and placed a small, insulated container on a console. Reese didn't have to look. He knew what it was, the next positive stimulus. He had requisitioned it himself. He walked over and opened the container. Inside, nestled in a bed of cooling gel, was a small white flower, a night-blooming jasmine. It was a rare, genetically engineered cultivar, designed to release its fragrance only in low light. Its scent was legendary, a heady, intoxicating perfume, said to have calming, almost euphoric properties. It was also, according to Valerius's research, a key component in the hypothetical pacifying agent. They were moving closer to the true purpose of the experiment. They were beginning to test the ingredients. Reese picked up the delicate flower. Its petals were like cool silk against his gloved fingers. He imagined giving it to Kale. He imagined the look on Kyle's face, the way his eyes would widen. He imagined the scent of the jasmine mingling with the soft, sweet scent of Kyle's trust. And he imagined, with a clarity that made him sick, what Valerius would do with that trust. He would weaponize it. He would distill it, bottle it, and use it to pacify a city, to crush a rebellion, to enforce a sterile, silent peace. He would take this fragile, beautiful thing they were building and turn it into another instrument of control. The flower felt heavy in his hand, a weight of impossible choices. He could continue to play the game, to build this bridge of trust, hoping he could somehow protect Kale from the other side. Or he could refuse. He could sabotage the experiment. But how? If he simply stopped, Valerius would replace him. If he was caught actively working against the project, he would be eliminated, and Kyle would be left to a fate far worse. He was trapped. His loyalty to the authority, a thing he had once held as sacred, was now a cage. He had to find a third path, a way to free them both. The thought was so radical, so treasonous, that it stole his breath. Escape. It was impossible. The facility, known only as the Spire, was a fortress, buried deep within a mountain, accessible only by a single, heavily guarded, maglev line. No one had ever escaped the Spire. But the alternative was to stand by and watch as Kale's soul was dissected and weaponized, to be the instrument of that violation. And he couldn't do it. He would not do it. A decision, cold and hard and terrifying, crystallized in his mind. He would continue to play the game. He would build the trust. He would get closer to Kale. He would become the Alpha's only lifeline. But he would not be doing it for Valerius. He would be doing it for them. He would gather information. He would learn the facility's routines, its weaknesses. He would use the access and authority Valerius had given him to plot a way out. It was a suicide mission. The chances of success were infinitesimal, but it was a chance. It was a choice. It was a reclamation of his own honor, his own soul. He looked back at the sleeping figure below. "I will get you out of here," he promised, a silent vow spoken into the cold, sterile air. "I will get you out, or I will die trying." He closed the container, the jasmine flower sealed once more in its cold, clinical prison. He would not give it to Kyle. Not yet. It was a piece of the puzzle, a part of Valerius's plan. And from now on, Rhys would be using the director's own pieces against him. He left the observation gallery, his footsteps sure and steady. For the first time since he had been given this assignment, he had a purpose he could believe in. He was still a centurion. He was still a soldier. But his war was no longer for the authority. It was for the man in cell 734. The next day, Kyle waited. He waited for the hiss of the tray, for the new stimulus, the new piece of the world Rhys would grant him. But the appointed time came and went. The tray did not appear. The cell remained empty. The silence, which had begun to feel less oppressive, once again took on a sharp, anxious edge. There was no food, there was no gift, and most disturbingly, there was no scent of pine. Rhys was not there. Panic, a cold and familiar serpent, began to uncoil in Cale's stomach. Had he done something wrong? Had his response to the book been incorrect? Had they decided the experiment was a failure? Was he to be returned to the blank, sensory-deprived existence of before? The thought was unbearable. He had tasted freedom, however illusory, and the thought of losing it was a new kind of torture. He paced the small cell, his bare feet tracing a frantic path on the cold floor. He clutched the book of poetry, his only link to the centurion, to the world of feeling and connection he had briefly inhabited. Hours passed. The regulated light in the cell dimmed, simulating the cycle of day and night. Still, nothing. Kyle slid to the floor, his back against the wall, a profound and desolate loneliness washing over him. He had been a fool to trust. He had been a fool to hope. It was all a game, and the game was over. He had lost. He didn't know how much time had passed when he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he had imagined it, a soft scratching at his door, not the clean, electronic hiss of the lock, but a physical, metallic sound. He froze, his heart hammering. The sound came again, a quiet, deliberate scraping. It was the sound of a manual override key. No one used manual keys unless the electronic systems had failed or unless they were trying to be silent. The door, which had always opened with a swift, pneumatic rush, now swung inward slowly, silently, on its physical hinges. And in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor, stood Rhys. He was not in his centurion armor. He was dressed in a simple, dark grey fatigue uniform, the kind worn by off-duty personnel. Without the imposing black armor, he looked different, more human, less of a symbol, and more of a man. In one hand, he held a small data slate. In the other, a standard-issue authority sidearm. His face was a mask of grim determination. He stepped into the cell, the door closing silently behind him. The small room was suddenly filled with his presence, with the clean, sharp scent of pine and cold stone now unmuted by filters. It was overwhelming, and Cale's instincts screamed at him, a confusing mix of terror and a desperate, primal sense of homecoming. Rhys looked at him, his dark eyes intense. He didn't speak. He simply raised the data slate. On its screen, in large block letters, were 5 words. "I am getting you out." Kyle stared at the screen, the words blurring, his mind struggling to comprehend. It was a trick. It had to be. Another test, a more elaborate, more cruel manipulation. He looked from the slate to Reese's face, searching for Kai-gi, for the lie. But he found none. He saw only a terrifying, desperate sincerity. Reese lowered the slate, and his gaze was unwavering. He was waiting for a response. Kale's throat was dry. He couldn't speak. He could only stare, his world tilting on its axis. Reese took a step closer. He knelt down, so they were at eye level. The proximity was dizzying. The alpha's scent was a physical presence, a weight, a warmth. It was everything his Omega biology had been starved of, and everything his conditioned mind feared. Reese slowly, carefully, reached out his ungloved hand. Not a fist, not a weapon, an open palm. He held it out, hovering in the space between them. An offering, an invitation, an act of trust so profound, so reckless, that it defied all logic. Kale looked at the hand. It was a strong hand, the knuckles scarred, the fingers long and steady. It was the hand of a soldier. It was the hand of a man who read poetry. It was the hand of his jailer. And it was, impossibly, the hand of his savior. He had a choice. He could retreat, back into the safe, dead world of Subject 734, or he could take the hand. He could step into the terrifying, unknown future that Reese was offering. He thought of the pair. He thought of the book. He thought of the man who had seen his pain and, instead of exploiting it, had chosen to defy a system to end it. His own hand, pale and trembling, lifted from his lap. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Reese's. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated sensation, more powerful than any drug, any pain, any pleasure he had ever known. It was the first time in 10 years he had touched another human being. A sob, raw and broken, tore from his throat. Tears he hadn't known he still possessed streamed down his face. He was not making a sound. He was a storm of them. And Reese did not tell him to be silent. He simply closed his hand around Kale's, his grip firm and warm and real. The game was over. The rebellion had begun. The touch was an anchor in a swirling vortex of disbelief. Reese's hand, warm and solid around his, was the only real thing in a world that had suddenly dissolved into terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Kyle's tears were silent, a hot, cleansing flood, but the sobs shaking his slight frame were audible, ragged gasps in the quiet of the cell. He was breaking, all the years of forced silence and emotional suppression shattering in a single, cathartic moment of human contact. Reese didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He just held on, his thumb moving in a slow, steady circle over Kyle's knuckles, a small, grounding gesture that spoke volumes. It said, "I am here. This is real. You are safe. Safety." It was a concept Kyle's body no longer understood, but his soul, battered and starved, recognized it instantly. He clung to Reese's hand as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. After a long moment, a lifetime, his sobs subsided into a series of shuddering breaths. He finally looked up, meeting Reese's eyes. The Centurion's face was etched with a grim urgency, but his gaze was soft, filled with a concern that was no longer a question, but a certainty. Reese gave his hand a gentle squeeze, then released it. The loss of contact was a physical ache. Reese raised a finger to his own lips, a clear, universal sign for silence. Then he turned his attention to Kyle's neck. At the base of his skull, Nestled just below the hairline was a small, almost invisible bio-monitor, a tiny subdermal implant that tracked his vitals and his location. It was his leash. Rhys gestured to it, then pointed to the sidearm he had placed on the cot. The meaning was clear. The monitor had to be disabled, and it wouldn't be pleasant. Fear, sharp and cold, pricked at Kale. But it was different now. It was not the formless, existential terror of his confinement. It was a practical fear, a fear of pain, a fear of a specific, necessary violence. And it was tempered by the trust he had just placed in the man before him. He nodded, a single, jerky motion. He turned, presenting his back to Rhys, his muscles tensing in anticipation. He heard the click of the sidearm's power cell being removed, the slide being racked to eject a chambered round. Rhys wasn't going to shoot it out. He was going to use the weapon's hardened casing as a tool. Kale squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself. "This will be fast." Rhys's voice was a low whisper right beside his ear. The warmth of his breath on Kyle's skin sent a shiver down his spine. "Don't make a sound." The words, the same words that had broken him before, were different now. They were not a command to suppress. They were a strategy for survival. This time, his body could obey. He clenched his jaw, focusing on the feeling of Rhys's free hand on his shoulder, a steadying pressure. There was a moment of cold, sharp pressure against his neck, then a sickening, surgical crack. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded at the base of his skull. A strangled cry caught in his throat, but he bit it back, swallowing it down, his body convulsing with the shock. It was over in a second. He felt a trickle of warmth run down his neck. Blood. Rhys's hand was there, pressing a small, sterile pad from a medkit to the wound. The pressure was firm, a counterpoint to the throbbing pain. "It's done," Rhys whispered. "The tracker is disabled. You're a ghost." A ghost. For the first time, the word didn't mean non-being. It meant freedom. Rhys helped him to his feet. Kyle was dizzy, the room swimming slightly, but the Alpha's hand on his arm was a steadying force. Rhys handed him a dark, bundled set of clothes. It was a standard-issue orderly's uniform. Simple, grey, anonymous. As Kale stripped off the thin, white tunic he had worn for a decade, he felt as if he were shedding a skin. The new fabric was rough against his skin, unfamiliar and abrasive, but it was a uniform of escape, not of imprisonment. It was armor. Rhys worked with quiet, efficient speed, his every movement economical and purposeful. He wiped the blood from Kyle's neck, his touch gentle but impersonal. He was a soldier on a mission, and Kyle was his objective. This was not about an emotional bond now. This was about logistics, about survival. "We have a window of 17 minutes, Rhys said, his voice low and clipped. The night shift change. The sensor grid in this sector is on a diagnostic reboot cycle. That's why I could use the manual key. Once we are out of this corridor, we are on live feed. We walk. We do not run. We belong. You are an orderly, transferring a sedated patient to the medical wing. I am your escort. You do not make eye contact with anyone. You look at the floor. You are tired. You are bored. You are invisible." He handed Kale a small white pill. "It's a mild sedative. It will slow your heart rate, mask your scent. It will make the lie believable." Kyle looked at the pill, then at Rhys. He was being asked to drug himself, to dull the senses he had just begun to reclaim. But he understood the necessity. In this world of constant surveillance, his own biology was a liability. His scent, his racing heart. They were signals that could betray them. He swallowed the pill dry, the bitterness of it a small price to pay. Rhys nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He put his Centurion helmet on, the dark visor obscuring his face, his voice now a slightly distorted electronic monotone from the helmet's speaker. He was no longer Rhys. He was a faceless instrument of the authority. The transformation was chilling and absolute. Stay close. Do exactly as I say. Are you ready? Cale looked around the small white cell, the only home he had known for a third of his life. The cot, the book of poetry still lying on the mattress, the ghost of the scent of a pear. It was a tomb, and he was walking out of it. He looked at the imposing, black-armored figure before him, the man who was risking everything. He gave a single, firm nod. Ready. Rhys opened the door, and they stepped out into the corridor. The world was a sudden, overwhelming rush of new sensations. The corridor was not silent. There was the low hum of the environmental controls, the distant whir of a cleaning drone, the faint rhythmic beep of a server bank. The air tasted different, still sterile, but layered with the faint, residual sense of other people, of cleaning solvents, of cooked food from a distant mess hall. It was a symphony of the mundane, and it was the most beautiful thing Cale had ever experienced. They walked. Rhys set a steady, unhurried pace, his heavy, armored boots making a solid, authoritative sound on the polished floor. Cale walked beside him, his head down, his eyes fixed on the grey tiles. He focused on the role. He was tired. He was bored. He was invisible. They passed two orderlies who averted their eyes, their posture subtly deferential to the Centurion's presence. They passed a technician who gave Rhys a crisp nod, his gaze flicking curiously to Cale for a split second before dismissing him. Coyle's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild bird in a cage, but the sedative was beginning to work, a soft, fuzzy blanket settling over his anxiety, slowing a machina of his panic. Rhys's hand rested lightly on his back, a constant, reassuring pressure. It was both a guide and a warning. Stay calm. I am here. They reached a junction. To the left was the medical wing, the lie they were supposed to be living. To the right was a service corridor, marked with a sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." Rhys guided him to the right. They were going off-script. The service corridor was darker, the walls unpainted durasteel, a network of pipes and conduits running along the ceiling. The air here was hot and smelled of ozone and hot metal. It was the guts of the machine. The Maglev station is patrolled. Rhys's voice crackled through his helmet speaker. The official departure logs are monitored in real time. We're not taking the train. He led Kyle to a heavy, reinforced blast door, a stenciled warning in block letters. GEO Thermal Ventilation Shaft 3. Extreme heat, lethal danger. Rhys placed his gloved hand on a small biometric scanner next to the door. A green light flickered. As a Centurion, he had alpha-level clearance. He could go anywhere. The lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic clank. The ventilation shafts run from the geothermal core deep below us, all the way to the surface, Rhys explained, his voice tight with tension. They vent superheated steam every 12 hours. The next cycle is not for another 4. We're going to climb. He opened the door. A wave of dry, searing heat washed over them. Kyle looked inside. It was a vertical shaft, a huge, circular tube of black metal, disappearing into darkness above and a faint, red glow below. A maintenance ladder was bolted to the side, a thin, skeletal spine of metal ascending into the gloom. Climb. The idea was insane. It had to be miles. Kale looked at Reese, his eyes wide with a question he couldn't voice. How? The helmeted face was unreadable. "This is the only way," Reese said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It will be hard. It will be dangerous. But it leads to the outside. It leads to the sky." The sky. Kale had not seen the sky in 10 years. He had almost forgotten it existed. The word itself was a myth, a line from a poem. Reese stepped into the shaft, his armored boots clanging on the metal grill of the platform. He turned, his dark visor fixing on Kyle. He held out his hand, the same hand he had offered in the cell. The same choice. "Trust me." This time, Kyle did not hesitate. He took the hand, and the rough texture of the glove a familiar comfort. He stepped over the threshold, out of the sterile, ordered world of the spire, and into the hot, dark, dangerous, unknown. The blast door clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing up and down the infinite shaft. The lock engaged, sealing them in. There was no going back. There was only up. The heat was a living thing. It pressed in from all sides, a dry, suffocating blanket that stole the moisture from Kyle's lips and lungs. The air tasted of hot iron and ancient baked dust. Below, the faint red glow pulsed, a malevolent heartbeat from the planet's core. Above, there was only blackness, a seemingly infinite column of it. The maintenance ladder was a cruel joke, its rungs thin, cold, and slick with some kind of oily residue. Reese started climbing first, his movements practiced and efficient, even in the bulky Centurion armor. The suit, Kyle realized, was not just for protection. It was a life support system. Its internal cooling mechanisms would be working overtime to keep Reese from cooking alive. Kyle, in his thin orderly's uniform, had no such protection. 100 meters at a time, Reese's voice echoed metallically in the shaft. "There are maintenance platforms every 100 meters. We rest there. We pace ourselves. Do not look down." Kale took a deep breath of the hot, dead air and began to climb. The first few rungs were easy, but his body was a foreign country to him. For a decade, his most strenuous exercise had been pacing his cell. His muscles, unused to this kind of exertion, began to protest almost immediately. A burning ache settled into his thighs, his calves, his shoulders. His hands, soft and uncalloused, screamed as they gripped the cold metal. He focused on the rhythm, hand over hand, foot over foot. He focused on the dark shape of Reese's armored boots just a few feet above him. They were his guide, his goal. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, his arms began to shake uncontrollably. His grip, slick with sweat, faltered. His foot slipped. For a terrifying second, he was dangling, his entire weight held by his straining fingers. Panic, pure and primal, seized him. A cry tore from his throat. "I can't." Reese stopped instantly. He looked down, his black visor an unreadable void. "Yes, you can." "I'm going to fall," Kyle gasped, his voice thin and reedy. "I will not let you fall," Reese said, his voice calm and absolute, cutting through Kale's panic. "Look at me, Kale." It was the first time he had said his name since that first day in the cell. Hearing it now, in this hot, dark hell, was a shock, a jolt of adrenaline. Kale forced his gaze upward, away from the terrifying drop below. He looked at the faceless helmet, the symbol of an authority he despised, but the voice was Reese's. "Breathe," Reese commanded, his voice softer now. "Just like I told you. In, out, match my rhythm." From the helmet's external speaker, Reese projected the sound of his own breathing, amplified and steady. A slow, deep, mechanical in and out. It was the sound of a machine, but it was also the sound of life. It was a lifeline. Kale closed his eyes, his cheek pressed against the cold metal of the shaft wall, and he listened. He forced his own ragged gasps to match the steady, rhythmic pulse. In, out, in, out. The panic slowly receded, replaced by a grim, teeth-gritting determination. His arms still screamed, his body still trembled, but his mind was clear. Good, Reese's voice rumbled. Now, find your footing, slowly. Kale did as he was told. He found the rung with his slipped foot, tested it, then put his weight back on it. He adjusted his grip. He was steady. The first platform is 10 meters above us. 10 meters. You can do that. Count the rungs with me. 1. Reese began to climb again, his voice a steady metronome in the darkness. 2, 3. Kyle followed, his own voice a hoarse whisper, joining the count. 4, 5. They counted together, their voices a strange, two-part harmony of man and machine, echoing in the vast, vertical tunnel. It was a litany of survival. By the time they reached 20, Kale was moving on pure animal instinct, his body a machine of pain and motion. The platform, a small metal grill jutting out from the wall, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He scrambled onto it, collapsing, his limbs trembling, his lungs burning. He lay on the hot metal, gasping for air, his uniform soaked in sweat. Reese stood over him, a black monolith. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply let Kyle be, giving him a moment to feel the pain, to feel the exhaustion, to know that he had overcome it. After a minute, Reese handed him a small metallic tube. Water. Small sips. The water was cool and tasted faintly of recycled minerals. It was ambrosia. Kyle drank, the liquid soothing the raw fire in his throat. "We have climbed 100 meters, Reese stated. "There are 9 more sections like this to the first pressure exchange. Then it gets harder. Harder." Kale couldn't imagine anything harder. He looked up at Reese, at the impassive black helmet. "Why?" he asked. His, voice a croak. "Why are you doing this?" For a long moment, Reese was silent. The only sound was the low hum of his suit's systems and the distant, ominous pulse from below. "When I was a boy," Reese said, his voice losing its electronic edge, becoming more human, more personal. "My family lived in the outer sectors. During the Unification Wars, a rogue faction of bio-terrorists released a pheromonal agent in our district. It was an early, crude version of what Valerius is trying to perfect. It was designed to incite territorial rage in alphas." He paused. The silence was heavy. "I was young. My own designation hadn't manifested yet. I was immune. I hid. And I watched. I watched my father, a good man, a gentle man, turn on his neighbors. I watched my world burn. The authority found me, days later, hiding in a service conduit. Not unlike this one." He looked away, his helmeted head turning to stare into the infinite blackness above. "I joined the Centurion Corps because I believed in their mission, to prevent that chaos from ever happening again, to create a world of order, of safety. I believed that control, even brutal control, was better than the alternative." He turned back to Kale. "But Valerius, he is not creating order. He is creating a more perfect form of chaos. He is taking the very thing that destroyed my world and trying to leash it. But you cannot leash a hurricane. You can only be destroyed by it, and he is willing to sacrifice your soul to do it." I will not be a part of that. I will not stand by and watch another good person be consumed by a war they did not choose. His confession hung in the hot, stagnant air. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of his own broken faith. Kyle saw him then, not as a centurion, not as a jailer, not even as a savior. He saw a man haunted by his past, a man who saw in Kale's situation a horrifying echo of his own history. He was not saving Kale out of pity. He was saving Kale to save himself. My mother, she was an Omega, Kale heard himself say, the words emerging from a deep, buried place. When the authority officers came, she tried to hide me. Her scent, it was like honey and salt. They found her because of it. They said her instincts were a threat to public order. He had not spoken of this to anyone. He had barely allowed himself to think of it. But in this hot, dark tube, hundreds of meters above the ground, with this strange, dangerous man, the truth came out. Reese was silent, but Kale felt it, a shift in the man's posture, a subtle change in the energy between them. It was the silent, profound understanding of a shared grief. They were both orphans of the same sterile, ordered world. They rested for a few more minutes, a silent communion of two broken souls. Then Reese straightened. It is time. He turned and began to climb. Kyle, his muscles still screaming, his body aching, got to his feet, looked up at the ladder, disappearing into the darkness. It was no longer just a path to escape. It was a pilgrimage. He took a breath and began to climb, one rung at a time, towards the sky. They climbed for hours. The world dissolved into a monotonous, agonizing rhythm of movement and pain. They passed platform after platform, each one a small island of reprieve in a vertical ocean of suffering. Reese was a machine. He never faltered, never slowed. He was a constant, steady presence above, a dark star to navigate by. Kale moved in a haze of exhaustion. His mind went blank, his thoughts stripped away until only the climb remained. Hand, foot, breathe. Hand, foot, breathe. It was a meditation, a punishment, a prayer. At the fifth platform, a new sound began, a low, deep groaning, echoing from far below. The walls of the shaft began to vibrate. The pressure is building, Reese said, his voice tense. The vent cycle is starting early. We have to move faster. Faster. The word was a mockery. Kale's body was a single, screaming nerve of protest. But the fear of the alternative, of being caught in a blast of superheated steam, of being boiled alive in this metal tube, was a powerful motivator. He pushed himself harder, his movements becoming sloppy, desperate. They reached the 8th platform, and the groaning from below had become a roar. The heat intensified, the metal of the ladder becoming almost too hot to touch, even through the thin fabric of Kale's gloves, which Reese had given him. Almost there, Reese shouted over the rising din. The pressure exchange is one more level up. At the 9th platform, a klaxon began to blare, a loud, urgent whoop, whoop, whoop that vibrated through Kale's bones. Red warning lights flashed, casting the shaft in a hellish, strobing glare. The roar from below was deafening. The vent was coming. They scrambled up the last 100 meters, pure adrenaline overriding the pain. Kyle could feel the heat pull his back, a physical wave pushing him upward. He saw the opening above, a circular hatch, and he climbed towards it with the last desperate dregs of his strength. Reese was already there, wrenching at the heavy locking wheel. The metal screamed in protest. It seized, he yelled. "The heat has warped the mechanism." Kyle scrambled onto the platform beside him, his heart a frantic, wild thing. They were trapped. The roar from below was a physical force, the air shimmering with heat. In a few seconds, they would be dead. Reese braced himself, his armored form a black silhouette against the flashing red lights. He put his entire body into it, his suit's servos whining at the strain. The wheel didn't budge. Kale looked at the hatch, then at Reese. He saw the futility, the desperation. And in that moment, something inside him, something primal and long suppressed, broke free. He opened his mouth and he screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated, instinctual power. It was the voice of his Omega nature, not as a weakness, but as a weapon. And with the scream came a scent, a massive, concussive wave of pheromones, a scent of pure, undiluted alarm, of mortal terror, but focused, weaponized. It was the scent of a cornered animal, of a mother protecting her young, of life refusing to be extinguished. It was the scent of ozone and lightning, of blooming nightshade, of every danger signal in the natural world, concentrated into a single, overwhelming blast. It had no effect on Reese, his helmet's filters protecting him, but it was not meant for him. It was meant for the machine. The klaxons, the sensors, the entire network of the spire was designed to detect and contain Omega pheromonal events. Kyle had just triggered every alarm in the entire facility. In the central control room, a dozen screens would be flashing crimson. Valerius would be seeing his theories made real, but in a way he could never have predicted. He had wanted to harness the storm. Kale had just become the storm. Reese, momentarily stunned by the sheer force of Kale's cry, understood instantly. It was a diversion, a massive, system-wide distraction. While the entire facility's security network focused on the catastrophic pheromonal event in geothermal shaft 3, other systems would be momentarily neglected. He looked at Kale, who was trembling, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrifying sense of his own power. Again, Reese commanded, his voice filled with a new, fierce urgency. Kale took a shuddering breath and screamed again, another wave of pure, instinctual power, another blast of scent that was a declaration of war against the sterile, silent world that had imprisoned him. And as the second wave hit, a new alarm sounded. A high-pitched, electronic squeal. A pressure valve somewhere in the system, overloaded by the conflicting signals, had failed. There was a loud bang, a shudder that ran through the entire shaft, and the locking wheel on the hatch above them, released from some internal pressure, suddenly spun free. Reese didn't hesitate. He gave the hatch a final, powerful shove. It flew open, revealing not a sky, but another maintenance tunnel. This one cool and blessedly quiet. He grabbed Kale, half lifting, half dragging him through the opening, and slammed the hatch shut behind them, just as a colossal, deafening roar of white steam erupted from the depths, a ghost of what would have been their tomb. They lay on the cool floor of the tunnel, gasping, their bodies trembling, the sound of the steam a muffled thunder below them. Kale was spent, drained, but he was alive. He had not been a victim. He had been a weapon, and he had saved them. Reese pulled off his helmet, his face slick with sweat, his eyes burning with a fierce, wild light. He looked at Kale, and for the first time there was no trace of pity, no trace of the jailer or the soldier. There was only awe and respect, I knew you were strong, Reese breathed, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't know you were a goddamn force of nature. Kyle could only look back, his throat raw, his body aching, but his spirit, for the first time in his life, soaring. He was not Subject 734, he was not a prisoner, he was Kale, and he was free. The tunnel was a blessed purgatory, cool, dark, and silent, save for the sound of their own harsh breathing and the distant, muffled roar of the steam vent below. For a long time, they just lay on the grimy duracrete floor, letting the coolness seep into their overheated bodies, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its wake. Kale felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the scream that had torn from his soul. That power, that instinctual weapon he hadn't known he possessed, had left him feeling fragile and profoundly changed. He had spent a decade believing his Omega nature was a sickness, a shameful vulnerability to be suppressed. In a single, desperate moment, it had become their salvation. Reese was the first to move. He pushed himself into a sitting position, leaning his back against the curved wall of the tunnel. He ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair, his chest still heaving. He looked at Kyle, and the intensity in his gaze was unsettling. It was a look of appraisal, but not the clinical assessment of a handler. It was the look of a soldier who has just seen a new, unpredictable weapon deployed on the battlefield, and is both awed and terrified by it. Valerius will be going insane, Reese said, a grim, humorless smile pulling his lips. A spontaneous, high-yield, targeted pheromonal event. He'll be dissecting the data for weeks. He'll think he's won the lottery. The thought of Valerius, of the spire, of the man who wanted to bottle his very soul, sent a chill through Kyle. They had escaped the shaft, but they were still deep in the belly of the beast. They'll be looking for us, Kyle whispered, his voice a raw, shredded thing. They'll be coming. Let them, Reese said, his voice regaining its command. He began checking his sidearm, his movements economical and precise. You didn't just create a diversion, Kale. You created chaos. You crashed the primary sensor network for the entire upper sector. The system is rebooting, section by section. Security teams will be responding to 1,000 false positives. We just bought ourselves more time. He reholstered his weapon and pulled out his data slate. A schematic of the spire's upper levels glowed on the screen. He traced a route with his finger. This is a tertiary service conduit. It leads to the outer atmospheric processing plant. From there, there's an emergency exit, a door that leads to the outside, the sky. The words were a prayer. It will be guarded, Kyle stated, the reality of their situation solidifying. Of course, it will be guarded, Reese said, not looking up from the slate. But they'll be looking for a centurion and an escaped prisoner. They won't be looking for 2 low-level maintenance workers. He gestured to their clothes. His plan had accounted for this. He was always one step ahead. Reese stood and offered Kyle a hand. This time, Kyle took it without hesitation and let Reese pull him to his feet. His legs were shaky, his muscles a symphony of pain, but his mind was sharp. The haze of the sedative had burned away in the heat of the climb and the fire of his own power. He was present. He was a participant, not just cargo. They began to move, Reese in the lead, his footsteps negotios, but swift. The tunnel was a labyrinth, branching and twisting, but Reese navigated it with unerring confidence, his eyes flicking between the data slate and the stenciled markings on the walls. They were in the spire's lungs, the vast, complex system that kept the sealed world of the facility alive. They passed huge, silent fans and conduits humming with power. The air grew cooler, fresher, tasting of ozone and filtered water. After 15 minutes of walking, Reese held up a hand, signaling a halt. They were at a junction, and from around the corner, they could hear voices. 2 men, their tones bored and complaining. "Whole system's gone haywire. Command is saying it's a drill, but I've never seen a drill crash the entire grid," one voice said. "I heard it was one of the Omegas in the Chiron wing," the other replied, his voice lower. "Had some kind of episode. Fried the sensors." Reese and Kale froze, pressing themselves into the shadows of a large junction box. Reese drew his sidearm, the movement silent and fluid. "They say the director's Centurion was in there with it, the scary one. Aileron. Maybe the thing finally broke him." The men laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Serves him right. Always walking around like he's got a Durasteel rod up his—" Their voices faded as they moved down an adjacent corridor. Reese waited a full minute after the sound of their footsteps had disappeared before he moved. He looked at Kale, his face unreadable in the dim light. The scary one, Aileron. It was a reminder of who he was, of the reputation he had cultivated. A cold, efficient, unquestioning tool of the authority. A man who was feared, not liked. A man without friends. It was a role that had kept him safe, that had allowed him to rise through the ranks. It was also a role that had left him utterly alone. And now he had shattered it for the man standing beside him, the one person who had seen past the armor. He didn't say anything. He just motioned for Kyle to follow, and they continued on their way. The atmospheric processing plant was a vast, cavernous space, filled with the roar of 100 air scrubbers and the hiss of cryogenic pumps. Catwalks crisscrossed the space, and workers in similar grey uniforms moved about their tasks, their faces anonymous, their movements routine. Reese and Kale, 2 more ghosts in the machine, walked among them. No one gave them a second look. They were just part of the background, Jejik, anonymity, their greatest defense. Reese led them to a far wall, to a heavy door marked with a yellow and black biohazard symbol and the words, "Emergency Atmospheric Vent." It was not a door for people. It was a pressure release valve for the entire facility, to be opened only in the case of a catastrophic environmental failure. And it led directly outside. 2 guards stood before it. They were not centurions, but standard authority grunts, armed with pulse rifles, their expressions a mixture of boredom and the low-level tension that had spread throughout the facility. This was the final hurdle. Reese slowed his pace, his body language shifting. He was no longer a nervous maintenance worker. He was a centurion again, even without his armor. His posture straightened, his walk became more authoritative. He approached the guards, Kyle a half-step behind him, head down, playing his part. "Report," Reese said, his voice cold and clipped, the voice of command. The guards, startled, snapped to attention. "Sir, nothing to report, sir. Sector is secure." "There has been a containment breach in the lower levels," Reese lied, his voice a blade. "Pheromonal agent, airborne. We're initiating a partial atmospheric flush. I need this vent opened. Now." The guards exchanged a nervous glance. "Sir, our orders are to hold this position. We need authorization from Central Command to—" Reese took a step closer into the lead guard's personal space. He was taller, broader, his presence radiating a palpable menace. "Are you questioning a direct order from a centurion, soldier?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The director himself has sanctioned this purge. Do you want to be the one who explains to Valerius why his command was delayed?" The mention of Valerius's name was a master stroke. The director's reputation for cold, clinical retribution was legendary. The guard swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "No, sir." "Then open the door." "Yes, sir." The guards fumbled with their keycards, then with the heavy, manual locking wheel. Kyle kept his eyes on the floor, his heart pounding, a frantic, wild rhythm. This was it. This was the precipice. The lock disengaged with a heavy thud. Reese placed his hand on the door. "Go," he whispered to Kale, a breath of sound. "The moment it's open, run. Don't look back." Kale looked up, his eyes meeting Reese's. He saw the cold calculation of the soldier, but underneath it, he saw the man who had given him a book of poetry, the man who had counted with him in the dark. "What about you?" Kale asked, his voice barely audible. A flicker of something, a sad, fatalistic acceptance, crossed Reese's face. "I am a centurion. I will hold the line." He was going to sacrifice himself. He was going to buy Kale time, creating a bottleneck, holding off the inevitable response teams, giving Kale a chance to disappear into the wilderness outside. He was going to die here. "No," Kyle said, the word a small, hard stone of defiance. He had not come this far, been dragged back from the brink of non-existence, only to leave his savior behind. Reese's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Before he could react, Kale did something utterly unexpected. He reached out and placed his hand on Reese's chest, right over his heart. He closed his eyes, and he didn't scream. He didn't release a wave of terror. He did the opposite. He reached for a different emotion, a feeling he had only just begun to relearn. The feeling of the pear's sweetness, the warmth of the bread, the beauty of the poetry, the solid, grounding presence of Reese's hand in his. He reached for trust, for gratitude, for the fragile, terrifying, beautiful thing that had grown between them in the dark, and he released it. A scent bloomed from him, soft and subtle, but profoundly powerful. It was not the sharp, cloying scent of distress. It was the fragrance of rain-washed stone, of new spring growth, of warm, sun-drenched wood. It was a scent of absolute, profound, and radical calm. It was the scent of peace. The two guards, who had been watching Reese with nervous tension, suddenly faltered. Their posture slackened. The hard, suspicious lines on their faces softened. A look of vague, dreamy confusion came over them. One of them slowly lowered his rifle, a small, placid smile on his face. "It's a nice night," he mumbled, his gaze unfocused. The other guard just stared, his eyes wide, his weapon forgotten. He looked like a man who had just been woken from a long, unpleasant dream. The pheromonal agent, the one Valerius had dreamed of, the pacifying cure for dissent, was real. And it was not a weapon of the authority. It was Kale's. Reese stared at Kale, his mind reeling. He could feel the effect, even on himself. A gentle, pervasive sense of well-being, a quiet in his own soul. It was a gift, a miracle. Kyle opened his eyes, a look of exhausted triumph on his face. "We go together," he said, his voice firm. Reese looked from Kale to the placid, non-threatening guards, to the door. He had planned for a battle. He had planned for a sacrifice. He had not planned for a miracle. He nodded, a slow, dawning sense of wonder on his face. Together. He pushed open the heavy door, and the outside world rushed in. It was not a riot of sensation. It was a quiet, overwhelming peace. The air was cold, sharp, and clean. It smelled of pine needles and damp earth and snow. It was the smell of Reese's own scent, but real, vast, and untamed. The sky was not blue. It was a deep, velvet black, punctured by a million pinpricks of cold, diamond-hard light. Stars, and above them, a huge, shattered moon hung in the darkness, its broken pieces casting a pale, ethereal glow on the landscape. Snow lay thick on the ground, a blanket of pure, untouched white. A gentle wind whispered through the towering pines, a sound so natural, so beautifully random, that it made Kale's heart ache. He stepped out of the spire, out of the machine, and took his first breath of free air in a decade. It was so cold it burned his lungs, but it was the burn of life. He was outside. He was under the sky. Reese stepped out behind him, the heavy door swinging shut, sealing them out of their prison. He stood next to Kale, and for a long moment they just stood in silence, two small figures in a vast, wild, and beautiful world. The spell on the guards would not last forever. The alarm would be raised. They would be hunted. But in this moment, under the light of the broken moon, none of that mattered. Kale reached out, his fingers finding Reese's. He didn't need to. There was no danger, no climb, no enemy to face. It was a simple, voluntary act of connection. Reese's fingers closed around his hand no longer a symbol of control or rescue, but of simple, shared presence. "I've never seen the stars," Kale whispered, his voice filled with a child's wonder. Reese looked up at the infinite, cold expanse. "They're just like the poems," he said, his voice quiet. They stood there, hand in hand, two fugitives, two survivors, two lonely souls who had found each other in the dark. Their future was a blank, unwritten page. They were hunted, and they were alone. But they were together, and for the first time, under the silent, watchful gaze of a million stars, they were free.